Just before his final days, Anthony Bourdain called a close friend, and the last two words he spoke were both simple and utterly heartbreaking. Those words are the key to understanding the incredible highs and devastating lows of a man who spent his life searching for connection. This is the story of the journey that led to that final, enigmatic message. The hunger for a different life. Before he was the world's culinary adventurer, a man who found poetry in the back alleys of forgotten cities, Anthony Bourdain was a boy of privilege who craved something money couldn't buy, a life with scars. His story begins not with a hunger for more, but with a profound and dangerous desire for less. A yearning for an authenticity he felt his comfortable life had denied him. His entire journey can be traced back to this single, restless ache born in the quiet suburbs of New Jersey. He was born in New York City in 1956, and as he grew, his family ascended from the working class to the cultural elite. His home filled with books, classic films, and a keen intellectual curiosity. But while many of his peers at a prestigious prep school came from broken homes or had absentee parents, Bourdain's stable and loving family life felt less like a blessing and more like a disqualification. He looked at the romantic turmoil of his rock and roll idols and the perceived hardships of his friends and felt a deep, gnawing sense of inauthenticity. The comfort he was raised in, the very thing others longed for, felt to him like a gilded cage, separating him from the raw, unfiltered world he desperately wanted to know. This resentment of his own good fortune pushed him to seek out intensity wherever he could find it. He took a turn onto a dark path. He later wrote that beginning around the age of 10, he'd been wildly fascinated with illicit substances. It was a romantic, dangerous idea to him, a shortcut to the raw experiences he felt his own life lacked, a way to manufacture the scars he believed were necessary for a life of meaning. When he finally had access to them, he dove in head first, claiming he took his first hit of acid when he was just 12. For the young Bourdain, it was not merely an act of adolescent rebellion. It was a conscious attempt to break through the comfortable facade of his suburban existence and touch something visceral and real. This impulse would spark a long and difficult battle with substance dependency that would follow him for decades, a shadow that walked alongside his brightest achievements. This profound ache for a life less ordinary, a hunger for authenticity born from a world of comfort, would define his entire journey. It was a restlessness that would soon find its first true expression, not in an act of rebellion, but in a single, perfect taste of the sea. The taste of another world. For most, it is just a simple shellfish, a delicacy from the sea. But for a young Anthony Bourdain, standing on the coast of France, a single oyster plucked from the water became the key that unlocked the entire world, setting him on a path from which he would never return. It was the first time the abstract hunger for a more authentic life, which had been stirring within him, was given a name, a taste, and a texture. On a family vacation, immersed in the cultured world his parents so loved, the young Bourdain was an observer, a restless soul peering out from the comfortable bubble of his upbringing. He found himself drawn to the docks of a small fishing village, a place of work, salt, and sea. It was a world of rugged men with calloused hands, a universe away from the manicured lawns of suburban New Jersey. He watched fascinated as a local fisherman worked, his movements practiced and sure. In a moment that would become legend in his own life's story, the fisherman noticed the curious American boy watching him. He pulled a gnarled, rough-shelled oyster from his haul, and with a quick, expert flick of his knife, shucked it open and offered it to the young Bourdain. It was more than a gesture of kindness. It was an invitation, a challenge to step outside the familiar and taste something raw, untamed, and true. For a moment, he hesitated. This was not the food of his family's dinner table. This was something pulled directly from the mysterious depths, a piece of the fisherman's world, he accepted. The taste was a shock, briny, cold, metallic, and alive. It was the taste of the ocean itself. In that single sensory explosion, the vague yearning for realness that had haunted his youth became a concrete experience. This was not a meal that had been prepared, or plated, or sanitized for his comfort. It was honest. It was connected to a place, a person, and a way of life. That single taste of the ocean was more than a meal. It was a revelation, the first true note in a symphony of experiences he would spend the rest of his life chasing. It awakened a hunger for the authentic world, a passion that would soon find its first human expression in a rebellious love that would define his youth. The rebel's first cause. Every rebellion needs a cause, a flag to rally behind. For the restless young Anthony Bourdain, that cause was not a political ideal or a philosophical movement. It was a girl. Her name was Nancy Pukowski, an older student who moved with a confidence and world-weariness that he found utterly captivating. She was the embodiment of the fast, free, and dangerous life he desperately longed to join. The first human face of the authenticity he had only ever tasted in a single oyster. In the hallways of his high school, Nancy and her friends represented everything his own comfortable life was not. They were a tough, jaded crowd, and to the young Bourdain, they seemed to possess a knowledge of the world that he could only read about in books. His infatuation was immediate and all-consuming. To belong in her orbit, to earn a place in her world, Bourdain embraced the lifestyle with reckless abandon. He fell in with her crowd, a group known for their intense and wild celebrations, and dove headfirst into a world with real consequences, all in the name of this defining, youthful love. Unlike the fleeting crushes of adolescence, this devotion did not fade with time. It set the course for his future. His desire to keep up with her, to close the distance that her age and experience had put between them, became his primary motivation. He worked with a fierce determination to finish high school a year early, driven not by academic ambition, but by the simple, powerful need to follow the woman he loved, who had already graduated and moved on to the prestigious Vassar College. His love for her was a compass, and it pointed him directly away from the safe, predictable world his parents had envisioned for him. This was more than a youthful infatuation. It was a defining obsession that set the trajectory for his entire young adult life. Nancy Pukowski was the muse who led him out of the suburbs and into a world of passion and risk, ultimately taking him to a prestigious university where he would discover once and for all that the life of the elite was a life he could never lead. A declaration in white. To his parents, it was a shocking betrayal of a carefully laid future, a rejection of the privileged world they had worked so hard to provide. For Anthony Bourdain, the decision to drop out of a prestigious university was his first true declaration of independence. It was a choice to trade a world of letters and theory for a life of fire, steel, and brutal honesty. He had followed Nancy Pukowski to Vassar College, but the romantic quest soon gave way to a profound sense of disillusionment. Surrounded by the very culture of affluence he had spent his youth resenting, he bristled at what he saw as the hypocrisy and lack of self-awareness in his fellow students. The world his parents so valued, a world of intellectual posturing and inherited status, felt utterly inauthentic to him. The hunger for something real, first awakened by that French oyster, had now become a roaring fire. He knew he did not belong in the ivory tower. His place was somewhere far grittier, somewhere more honest. Within 2 years, he shocked his parents with his decision. He was leaving Vassar to enroll at the Culinary Institute of America. The professional kitchen, in his mind, represented everything Vassar was not. It was a pure meritocracy, a place where the only things that mattered were skill, toughness, and the ability to endure the nightly chaos. It was a world of immediate consequences, populated by a diverse tribe of misfits and and artisans, a far cry from the sheltered lives of his university peers. This was not just a career change, it was an alignment of his soul with a craft he believed in. His parents were horrified. As Bourdain would later write, they reacted as if he'd chosen to pursue a life of crime. To them, a chef was a blue-collar servant, a step down from the life of the mind they had envisioned for their son. They could not understand that for him, the chef's whites were a badge of honor, an entry into a brotherhood of hard-working outsiders where he finally felt he might belong. By trading the manicured lawns of Vassar for the fiery chaos of the kitchen, he had made his choice. Now, with Nancy by his side, he would step into the heart of New York City to build this new life, unaware that the same demons he thought he was outrunning were waiting for him there, chasing ghosts in the city. In the grit and glamour of 1980s New York, Anthony Bourdain, now a graduate of the Culinary Institute, set out with Nancy Pukowski to build a life. They found jobs and an apartment, the humble beginnings of a shared dream, forged in the fiery trenches of the city's kitchens. But alongside that dream, they chased their shared demons, and the ghosts of their rebellious past followed them into the chaotic heart of the metropolis. The wild spirit that had defined their youth did not simply fade with the responsibilities of adulthood. The intense celebrations of their high school and college years escalated in the anything-goes atmosphere of the city at that time. For Bourdain, the quest for authenticity had curdled into something darker, a flirtation with a dangerous underworld that he mistook for a more profound reality. His involvement in the world of illicit substances deepened, and he was drawn not just to the escape, but to the thrill and danger of the life itself. He wasn't merely a passive participant. He dabbled in the occasional deal, courting the risk as a badge of honor. He later recalled a heart-stopping moment, driving through the city with 200 hits of acid in his car, when the flashing lights of a police cruiser suddenly appeared in his rearview mirror. On another occasion, a routine trip to the post office turned into a paranoid nightmare when he became convinced that federal agents were watching him, a stark reminder of the perilous game he was playing. He was living the life he thought he wanted, one of intensity and raw experience, a world away from the manicured lawns he had fled. But the romance of the outlaw life was beginning to fade, replaced by a gathering darkness. He was hurtling down a destructive path, a journey into a wilderness from which many never return. It would take a single grim calculation in the back of a taxi, a moment of chilling clarity, to make him realize where that path was truly leading. The grim calculus. Sometimes a life changes not with a bang, but with a quiet, chilling thought. In the back of a New York City cab, hurtling through the night with friends, a casual dark joke suddenly became a moment of terrifying clarity. It was a simple statistic about survival that forced a young Anthony Bourdain to confront his own mortality and make a choice that would alter the course of his entire life. By this point, the romanticism of his dangerous lifestyle had long since evaporated, replaced by a grim and demanding routine. He was working his way up in the city's kitchens, becoming a sous chef for the first time. But his career was a string of gigs in failing restaurants, an instability that only intensified the chaos in his personal life. He would frequently disappear between grueling kitchen shifts to seek out his next fix. The thrill was gone, leaving only the relentless, exhausting machinery of dependency. His world felt unmoored, a feeling made worse when his parents separated after 26 years of marriage, removing the last anchor of his former life. It was during this period that he found himself in a taxi with 3 friends on a familiar mission into the city's nightlife. With a flash of the gallows humor that would later become his trademark, Bourdain casually quoted a statistic he had heard, that only 1 in 4 people struggling with dependency will ever get clean. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then he looked around the cab, at the faces of his 3 friends, and at his own reflection in the window. 1, 2, 3, 4. In that instant, the abstract number became a terrifyingly personal prophecy. It was a grim calculus, a simple equation with his own life in the balance. the romance of the suffering artist, the quest for a life with scars, all of it dissolved in the face of that cold, hard probability. As he would later recall, it was in that moment, looking at the three people who shared his fate, that he made a quiet, resolute decision. He was going to be the one. The desire for a life of ruin was replaced by a fierce will to live. The long climb back. The will to survive, ignited in the back of a speeding taxi, was a powerful first step. But the decision to climb out of the abyss and the long, treacherous journey to the light are two very different things. For Anthony Bourdain, the path to recovery was not a straight line, but a harrowing battle fought against his own deepest demons. A climb that would take him to the absolute bottom before he could finally see the top. His first move was to quit heroin, which he accomplished by entering a methadone clinic. It was a difficult clinical process, but in the void left by one substance, another quickly took hold. He turned to crack, trading one form of dependency for another, and descended into a period of deep desperation. He would still, somehow, make it to work, his ingrained professional pride a final bulwark against total collapse. Outside the kitchen, however, his life was unraveling in the most heartbreaking of ways. The moment of ultimate surrender came one Christmas. Completely broke and driven by a desperate need, he gathered his most prized possessions, his beloved record collection. These were not just objects, they were his connection to his father, to his intellectual life, to the music that had shaped his very soul. He carried them to Broadway, laid them out on a blanket on the cold pavement, and set about selling his history, piece by piece, just to get enough money for a fix. It was in that moment, watching his past being sold off to strangers on a festive street, that he finally decided he had had enough. That cold, lonely Christmas was his rock bottom. He had finally found the bottom, the solid ground from which he could begin to push himself up. But even with a newfound resolve, fate had one more ironic ordeal in store for him. A bizarre chapter that would place him right back in the heart of the world he was trying to escape. Was it even possible to find an honest living after living so dishonestly for so long? He had survived the abyss, but the hunger for authenticity that drove him into the darkness now demanded he find a new way to live. This next chapter would be a test not of his endurance for chaos, but of his strength to build a life of purpose, a journey that would take him from the criminal underworld to the peak of the culinary world. A king in a fallen kingdom. He had survived the abyss and chosen a new path, a life free from the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. But fate, with its penchant for cruel irony, had one more test for Anthony Bourdain. In his search for an honest living as a chef, he found himself an unwitting employee in the heart of the criminal underworld, a craftsman in a kingdom run by mobsters. The restaurant empire was a front for organized crime, a place of whispers, hidden ledgers, and a constant, low-grade hum of danger. This was the kind of gritty, authentic world he had once romanticized, a place far from the sanitized suburbs of his youth. The reality, however, was far from glamorous. He was a skilled chef, a king in his kitchen, but a powerless pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game that was being played out in the front of the house. His newfound sobriety was immediately put to the most extreme test imaginable. The kitchen, a place that should have been his sanctuary, a realm of order and craft, was now a minefield of temptation. The very line cooks meant to assist him were not there for their culinary skills. They were, in fact, the boss's dealers, moving cocaine alongside sacks of flour. The proximity to the life he had just fought so desperately to escape was a constant, taunting presence, a daily test of the resolve he had forged on that cold Christmas morning. This experience, however, taught him a different kind of toughness. It was not the romantic, self-destructive bravado of his youth, but the quiet, resilient strength of a man simply trying to do his job and stay clean in an impossible environment. He navigated this surreal kingdom with a newfound strength, proving to himself that his sobriety was real. But just as he was finding his footing, a sudden and devastating loss would strike at the very core of his identity, a blow far deeper than any kitchen battle. The North Star extinguished. He was shucking oysters at a raw bar in the East Village, his hands calloused and sure, a world away from the high culture life of his parents. It was there, amidst the ice and the brine, that Anthony Bourdain received the news that would extinguish a guiding light in his life. The man who had first instilled in him a sense of curiosity and adventure was gone. Bourdain always spoke of his father with a deep and abiding admiration. It was from him that he inherited his love of books, classic films, and intellectual exploration. His father represented a more noble form of adventure, one of the mind and spirit, a stark contrast to the self-destructive path of physical excess that Bourdain had been walking. He was a North Star, a moral and intellectual compass for a son who often felt lost. In many ways, his father was the man he always hoped he would one day become. The news came without warning. His father had suffered a heart attack at home and passed away suddenly at the age of 57. For a man like Bourdain, who had just recently stared into the abyss and chosen to live, this sudden, arbitrary loss was a devastating blow. He had just fought his way back to the world of the living, only to have the man who gave him life snatched away. The world, which had only just begun to feel stable, was once again tilted on its axis. The loss forced a profound reckoning. Confronted so brutally with the fragility of life, he began to think about his own legacy. What would he leave behind? He had to keep moving, not just to stay afloat financially in the unforgiving city, but to build a life that would honor the man he had lost. The loss of his father was a wound that would never fully heal, but it left him with a renewed and urgent sense of purpose. That quiet determination would soon lead him to a haven on Park Avenue, a kitchen where he would finally find his footing. A haven on Park Avenue. After nearly 2 decades of wandering through the culinary wilderness, a journey marked by failed restaurants and personal demons, Anthony Bourdain finally found a port in the storm. On Park Avenue South, at the bustling French bistro Brasserie Les Halles, he wasn't just another line cook fighting for his place. He was a commander, finally given a kingdom of his own. This haven would become the bedrock upon which he would build the rest of his life. By the late 1990s, Bourdain was a seasoned veteran of the New York restaurant scene, a man who had seen it all and carried the scars to prove it. When the management at the popular Les Halles brought him on as executive chef, it was the opportunity he had been working towards his entire career. For the first time, he was given real freedom, the power to run a kitchen the way he saw fit, to create a menu he was proud of, and most importantly, to hire the people he wanted to work with. He assembled a crew of fellow misfits and outcasts, a loyal and hard-working band of pirates who mirrored his own journey. The kitchen at Les Halles became more than just a workplace. It was a sanctuary, a family forged in the heat of the nightly service. For Bourdain, this was the purest form of meritocracy he had ever known. It was a place where your past didn't matter, where the only things that earned you respect were your skill with a knife and your willingness to work harder than the person next to you. After a lifetime of feeling like an outsider, he had finally found his tribe. The stability of this role brought him a sense of peace and professional fulfillment that had long eluded him. The hours were still grueling, the work still demanding, but the gnawing chaos of his earlier years had finally subsided. It was in the quiet moments afforded by this newfound stability, in the off hours away from the heat and clatter of the kitchen, that he had the mental space to pursue a little side hobby. Brasserie Les Halles was the haven that allowed Anthony Bourdain to finally find his footing, and in that quiet, a new voice began to emerge. The confession heard round the world. In the precious few hours away from the searing heat and relentless pressure of the kitchen, Anthony Bourdain pursued a quiet hobby. With a pen and paper, in the solitude of his small New York apartment, he would document the secret world he inhabited, a world of fire, loyalty, and beautiful chaos. He never dreamed that one of these dispatches from the culinary underground would soon become a confession heard round the world, igniting a phenomenon that would change his life forever. He had spent the better part of a decade putting his thoughts and stories to paper in his off time. One day, he wrote a long essay, a raw, witty, and unflinchingly honest look at the inner workings of a professional kitchen. It was intended as something of a caution to the city's restaurant guests, pulling back the curtain to reveal the sweat, the secrets, and the fierce camaraderie of the line cooks who prepared their meals. He tried to get it published, but had little luck at first. A brilliant voice waiting in the wings for someone to finally hear it. Without the persistence and intuition of his mother Gladys, the world may never have known the name Anthony Bourdain. Still working as an editor for the New York Times, she read her son's essay, and her professional instincts immediately told her it was special. This was more than just a mother's pride. It was a seasoned editor, recognizing a powerful, authentic voice that demanded to be heard. She knew someone who was friends with an up-and-coming editor at The New Yorker. She passed the essay on, urging him to run it, championing her son's work with a quiet but firm belief. The editor at The New Yorker read it and knew instantly he had to publish it. The piece caused an immediate sensation, a shockwave that rippled through the literary and culinary worlds of New York and beyond. No one, least of all Bourdain himself, had any idea of the forces they had just unleashed. That single essay, a loving gift from a mother to her son's career, was about to change everything, bringing him a success that would save his finances, but would ultimately cost him his home. But the question remained, could the man who wrote so honestly about his demons finally escape them? The price of the dream. Within a week of his essay's publication, Anthony Bourdain had a book deal. The resulting memoir, Kitchen Confidential, was a phenomenon, a bolt of lightning that solved all his financial problems and lifted him from obscurity almost overnight. But the brilliant, relentless light of fame would soon cast a long shadow over his life, eroding the one constant relationship that had survived every storm, his marriage to Nancy Pukowski. Before the book, Bourdain was still struggling. Despite his position at Lay Hall, years of spotty employment had left him in terrible debt, behind on taxes and rent, with no insurance. Kitchen Confidential changed all that, bringing him a level of financial security he had never known. But that security came at a steep personal price. Through all the years of addiction and failure, through every dark period and professional disappointment, Nancy had been by his side. She was the anchor of his tumultuous life. Their hard-partying youth in the 1980s had mellowed into a comfortable, quiet domesticity in the 1990s. Their life was one of takeout meals and watching reruns of The Simpsons. Every year, they took a sacred trip to the Caribbean, spending blissfully happy nights, sipping cold beer, and eating fresh seafood on the sand. It was a simple, peaceful existence, the hard-won spoils of a long and difficult journey they had navigated together. This quiet stability, however, was no match for the hurricane of fame that was about to hit. As television producers began approaching Bourdain to host his own show, Nancy had a bad feeling. She had stood by him through his failures and successes in both the restaurant and literary worlds. But this was different. This new life of constant travel and public scrutiny was not the one she had signed on for. Their lives, once so deeply intertwined, were suddenly on two completely different paths. The 20-year marriage that had been his harbor was now adrift, and they separated before eventually divorcing in 2005. The fame he had stumbled into had torn his world in two, leaving him bereft at the very moment he was supposed to be triumphant. A whisper on the edge. From the outside, Anthony Bourdain was one of pop culture's newest and brightest stars, a celebrated author and television host with legions of adoring fans. But on the inside, he was a man suffering, utterly devastated by the collapse of his 20-year marriage. On a lonely night, in a place that once brought him joy, he would confront the dark price of his new life, a moment of despair that brought him to the very edge of oblivion. He had returned to St. Martin, an island in the Caribbean that he and his wife Nancy had often visited together. It was a place filled with memories of happiness and peace. But now, alone, every familiar beach and every warm breeze was a painful reminder of what he had lost. The fame and success that now surrounded him felt hollow and meaningless in the face of this profound personal failure. Adrift in a paradise that now felt like a prison, he spent the night drinking, trying to quiet a pain that only grew louder. Fueled by alcohol and despair, he got into his car and began to drive along the winding coastal roads. As the ocean crashed against the rocks below, he made a decision. He pointed the car toward the edge of a cliff, a final, desperate act to silence the heartbreak that had consumed him. It was a moment of profound darkness, a surrender to the crushing weight of his sorrow. The life he had fought so hard to reclaim just years earlier was now, in his mind, no longer worth living. But in that final moment, as the car sped toward the precipice, a small piece of magic broke through the darkness. A song he liked came on the radio. He would later say he took it as a sign, a whisper from the world of small beauties he still loved, a random note of grace in the depths of his despair. At the last possible second, he turned the wheel. He had survived his own inner turmoil, but his travels would soon plunge him into a real-world conflict that would change his perspective forever. Dinner in a war zone. His mission was to travel the world, to break bread with strangers, and show how a shared meal could bridge any divide. But in the summer of 2006, while filming in the vibrant, beautiful city of Beirut, the world's harsh realities came crashing in. The culinary adventurer and his television crew, there to celebrate a culture through its food, suddenly found themselves trapped in the middle of a war zone. They had arrived in Beirut, the so-called Paris of the Middle East, with the joyful intention of filming an episode of his hit show, No Reservations. They were exploring the city's legendary food, its sophisticated nightlife, and its unique blend of cultures. Then, the world exploded. Israel launched a series of missile strikes against the city, and the sounds of celebration were replaced by the sounds of conflict. Bourdain and his crew retreated to the relative safety of their hilltop hotel, becoming unwilling spectators to a city under siege. From their balcony, they watched the city burn. The beautiful, lively streets they had walked just hours before were now shrouded in smoke, the night sky illuminated by the flashes of distant explosions. The adventure had become terrifyingly real. This was no longer a television show about food. It was a harrowing lesson in geopolitics and the fragility of peace. After several days of uncertainty, they were eventually transported to a local beach to be evacuated by a marine ship. It was on that beach that Bourdain had an experience that would haunt and transform him. As he waited for his rescue, a privileged American television host being whisked to safety, he looked at the crowds of local families on the sand around him. They clutched what few belongings they could carry, their faces etched with fear and loss, having just fled from their burning homes. In that moment of profound humility, his role in the world crystallized. He was not just a food tourist, he was a witness. He returned from the ordeal, a changed man, shaken, but with a new sense of purpose. An unexpected harbor. He returned from the trauma of Beirut a changed man, shaken by the world's harsh realities and newly aware of his own mortality. It was in this state of vulnerability and reflection that he found an unexpected harbor, a fiery and intelligent woman named Otavia Busia, who would, in a whirlwind romance, give him the one thing he never thought he would have: a family. His close friend, the renowned French chef Eric Rippert, knew how lonely Bourdain had been since the end of his first marriage. Seeing a kindred spirit in Otavia, a hostess at one of his restaurants, Rippert decided to play matchmaker. The connection between Bourdain and Busia was immediate, intense, and unconventional. On their second date together, in a move that spoke volumes about their passionate and impulsive natures, they got matching tattoos. It was the beginning of a fast and fierce love affair. Bourdain had been dating Otavia for 8 months when he left for Beirut. When he returned, the harrowing experience had solidified something within him. The fragility of life was no longer an abstract concept. and he was ready to make a drastic change. He had never had children with his first wife, but as Bourdain later put it, they decided to spin the wheel. She became pregnant, and in 2007, his daughter, Ariane, was born. For a man who had spent a lifetime as a restless wanderer, becoming a father at the age of 50 was a profound, life-altering event. 11 days after their daughter's birth, they tied the knot. Family life gave Bourdain a newfound lease on life, a sense of purpose, and a deep, grounding love that he had never expected to find. The weight of the world. Fatherhood had given Anthony Bourdain a new anchor, a reason to stay grounded in a world that was constantly pulling him away. But the demands of his global fame were relentless and unforgiving. Traveling for more than 250 days a year, the man who brought the world together found himself increasingly separated from the people he loved the most. A tragic irony that would soon lead to a familiar heartbreak. After so many years spent struggling to make ends meet, battling for every scrap of success, Bourdain found it impossible to say no. Every offer for a new show, every book tour, every speaking engagement felt like a blessing he couldn't afford to refuse. A deep-seated insecurity, born from decades of financial instability, drove him to keep running, to keep working, as if he feared the incredible luck he had found might vanish the moment he stood still. His success was a dream he had never dared to have, and he was terrified of waking up. This grueling, self-imposed schedule soon took its inevitable toll. When his daughter, Ariane, started elementary school, his family could no longer join him on his endless travels. A heartbreaking pattern, the very one that had unraveled his first marriage, began to repeat itself. The long absences, the fleeting reunions, and the profound loneliness of a life lived on the road began to create an unbridgeable distance between him and his wife. The man who seemed to belong everywhere, at any table, in any country, no longer had a home to return to. The couple separated in 2016, a quiet and sorrowful drifting apart. In a poignant twist of fate, the announcement of their separation came just before he began promoting a new cookbook titled Appetites, a volume filled with recipes he made for his family. The book was a beautiful and loving portrait of a home life that, in reality, had already ceased to exist. The dream had once again exacted its price, leaving him successful, celebrated, and profoundly alone. Was he now destined to repeat the mistakes of his past forever? He was adrift once more, a man who had gained the world, but lost two families in the process. This familiar heartbreak, now amplified by the loss of his life as a father, would be followed by a sudden health scare that would force him to look inward, to confront the ghosts of his past, and make one last desperate attempt to change his fate. A letter to the past. He was a man in constant motion, a world traveler who never seemed to stand still. But during a trip to France while working on a book, a sudden and terrifying health scare brought his whirlwind life to a screeching halt. This brush with his own mortality would send him on an unexpected journey, not to another country, but back into the landscape of his own past, forcing him to confront the ghosts of his romantic failures. Plagued by a nasty skin infection for 3 painful days, he finally went to a doctor who prescribed him medication. Later, having taken too many of the pills on an empty stomach, he blacked out, waking up disoriented in the doorway of a restaurant, a frantic waiter trying to revive him. For a man who prized control and prided himself on his physical endurance, this sudden loss of consciousness, this sheer vulnerability, was terrifying. The incident shook him to his core because it was a chilling echo of his deepest loss. It instantly reminded him of his father's sudden heart attack, the arbitrary, and shocking nature of his unexpected passing. It was a memento mori, a stark and visceral reminder that life could be taken away in an instant without warning or ceremony. He was terrified. That night, alone with his thoughts and his fear, he sat down and began to write. He composed a long, heartfelt email, not to his current friends or colleagues, but to his first wife, Nancy Pukowski. It was a confession, an apology for all the ways he felt he had wronged her, a torrent of regret for the romantic failures that haunted him. This deeply vulnerable act was a reckoning, an attempt to make peace with the man he had been. That long letter into the night was more than an apology. It was a quiet vow to be someone different, a desperate desire to finally find a lasting love and rewrite the ending of his own story. A final, fierce love. Fresh from a painful reckoning with his past, Anthony Bourdain was a man determined to finally get love right. He found what he was looking for in 2017 in the fiery and charismatic Italian actress and director Asia Argento. This final, fierce love would consume him, pushing him to become a powerful public advocate and to make drastic choices that would stun his oldest friends and colleagues. Their relationship was a striking and passionate affair, and Bourdain poured all of his efforts into making it work, determined not to repeat the patterns of distance that had defined his previous marriages. Friends recalled how deeply in love he was, how this relationship seemed to give him a new, intense, and all-encompassing focus. That focus would soon be tested on a global stage. Later that year, at the height of the Me Too movement, Bourdain stood unwavering by Argento's side as she came forward with her harrowing story of an assault at the hands of Harvey Weinstein. He became one of the movement's most vocal and powerful male supporters, a fierce champion for women's voices. He used his own considerable platform to demand accountability and was one of the first people to publicly name and shame the celebrated chef Mario Batali for his alleged inappropriate conduct. His devotion was not just public. It began to reshape his professional life in profound ways. When the director for an episode of his show, Parts Unknown, fell ill in Hong Kong, Bourdain hit two birds with one stone, suggesting they bring on Argento as director. While many friends recalled how happy he was to be working with her, the situation quickly became complicated. After Argento argued with the show's longtime respected cinematographer, Bourdain, in a move that shocked the loyal crew, fired the cinematographer. It was a stunning decision, a sign of his absolute, unwavering allegiance to Argento. He was willing to disrupt the successful, well-oiled machinery of his own show, alienating loyal colleagues in the process, to support and integrate her into every facet of his world. He had thrown himself into this final love with the full force of his being, a fierce advocate and a devoted partner, willing to sacrifice anything. But this all-consuming passion was beginning to take its toll. The unraveling. He had thrown himself into his final love with a fierce all-or-nothing intensity. But as the months wore on, the weight of his public battles and his private passions began to take a visible toll. Those closest to Anthony Bourdain, the friends and family who knew the man behind the icon, began to worry as the person they knew became more erratic, more isolated, and more prone to the darkness that had always lingered at the edges of his life. The pressures were immense. He was balancing his relentless television schedule, his writing, his responsibilities as a father, and his all-consuming new relationship. His ex-wife, Ottavia Busia, worried about his state of mind, but took some comfort in the knowledge that he was seeing a therapist. Still, the warning signs grew. Friends and longtime crew members saw a man who was becoming increasingly unpredictable, a leader who had once been the steady heart of their traveling circus, now lost in a storm of his own making. In early June of 2018, the storm broke. While Bourdain was in France filming an episode of his show with his dearest friend, Eric Reipert, the tabloids published paparazzi photos of Asia Argento in the arms of another man. For a man who had sacrificed so much for this relationship, a man whose romantic failures haunted him, this public betrayal was a devastating blow. The episode they were working on in the beautiful French countryside would never air. On June 8, 2018, after Bourdain had missed both a planned dinner and breakfast, a deeply concerned Eric Reipert went to his hotel room. There, he discovered that his beloved friend had taken his own life. He was 61 years old. The news sent a shockwave of grief around the globe, a collective cry of disbelief and sorrow for a man who had seemed so full of life and curiosity. In the immediate aftermath, a desperate search for answers began. Love abounds. In the immediate aftermath of his tragic loss, a storm of grief and anger swept across the globe as a heartbroken public searched for simple answers to an unspeakable question. But far from the noise of speculation, one of his closest friends held a final, quiet message from Bourdain himself, a simple, poignant phrase that offers not an explanation, but a beautiful and heartbreaking testament to the man he was. The public narrative was chaotic and painful. Many were quick to point fingers at Asia Argento. Heartbroken, she eventually broke her silence, claiming their relationship had been an open one. The story was further complicated when the New York Times published allegations that Argento herself had a history involving inappropriate contact with a young actor, and that Bourdain had paid a settlement of $380,000 on her behalf to avoid negative publicity. The world speculated on how these pressures had affected him, searching for a single reason for his final, desperate act. But, as the months wore on, those who knew him best began to speak out, painting a far more complex and human picture. They spoke of a man who was, yes, deeply in love, but also one who had battled his own darkness and bouts of depression for his entire life. They described a man who felt the immense, crushing weight of his fame, his responsibilities, and his own relentless standards. The search for a single cause began to dissolve into the much more complicated truth of a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. Amidst all the noise, one clear final message emerged. The author Michael Ruhlman, one of Bourdain's close friends, spoke about their final phone conversation. He said that Bourdain seemed happy, that he was in love. One of the last things Bourdain told him was both simple and profound. Love abounds. In the end, these two words are all that is left. A final, enigmatic message from a man who spent his life searching for connection. It is a phrase that stands in stark, beautiful contrast to the darkness of his final moments. It is a testament to the man who, despite his own demons, never stopped believing in the power of a shared meal and a shared humanity. A final, heartbreaking grace note to a life lived without reservation. Thank you for joining us on this journey into a complex and beautiful life. If this story offered you a new perspective, please show your support with a like and subscribe for more in-depth stories that honor the icons who shaped our world. Thanks for watching.